Hello everyone, it's great to be here and to be invited. So I will talk about the mostly discrimination, how it starts, but also how it's reflected in the institutions and how we actually approach to solving the issues of discrimination, particularly focusing on those who are the youngest one, children. So I have a background in rights of the child, and as we can see, discrimination starts from the beginning of life. It's reflected because children are dependent on their caregivers, and those they are facing two types of discrimination. Actually, they have multiple grounds of why they're discriminated against. First of all, because they're dependent on their guardians or safeguard, they're not treated in the same way as adults are, and that is actually not recognized as such. And we have the Convention on the Rights of the Child that explicitly prohibits the discrimination against children on any ground. And the Committee on the Rights of the Child actually identified at least 53 grounds of discrimination of children. However, children are actually not protected from being discriminated against because they're children. We can see that in numerous aspects. I think the most disturbing one is actually when it comes to environmental protection, because when we set the standards for protecting from harm, environmental harm, we actually set the standard against the adult who has developed immune system and not children. So it's not surprising that children are 5 times more likely to die from environmentally born disease than adults. And the same goes when it comes to education of children, and actually the educational system reflects quite well the discrimination, how we are treated others in the society, because children, especially when in the early childhood education and elementary school or first stage of education, we can see how actually children are just reproducing the same systems of discrimination that they are faced with either in their family environment or in schools. So often it happens that bullying or peer violence in schools are reflective of discrimination. Now, depending on the context, if it's multicultural, multicultural school, then usually the ground for discrimination is different cultures, race, etc. But if it's not so diverse environment, like you have in some parts of the Europe, then it's usually based on economic status, education of the parents, and etc. So basically, children are just reproducing the same systems. What is important to address is how we actually, within the school systems and also public institutions, and accessing the essential public services such as health, education, etc., we address the discriminatory practices. First of all, discrimination starts with the idea. It starts as a thought, and then we develop that thought, and then we started to identify people who are not the same as us, which is also part of the developing process of a child. When child discovers it's not the same as the caregiver, and then use the separation to discriminate itself against its environment, and then see I'm the same, and that's how actually also different identities are formed. But in that exercise of separation, it's quite important to learn, to teach actual children how not to be, to have those, discrimination is not necessarily, like, if we define, actually, maybe to rephrase, discrimination, if we define it as distinction, it's not necessarily always bad, because we want to, distinguish something that is wanted and not wanted. So in that, if we define discrimination as such, then it's a good exercise. But however, if we define discrimination, but if we define discrimination as exclusion, then we have a quite challenge ahead of us. So sometimes being non-discriminatory and being inclusive is not always an easy task to do. It's quite challenging, and it requires a lot of fine-tuning and adjustments. So one of the first steps would be to actually, within the educational system, focus a lot on how we actually self-regulate our emotions and how we actually deal with otherness. First, it's about the creation of narratives that we use, us against them. And then from the previous discussion, it's quite obvious, especially in the context of the rise of the extreme right, how it actually works, because you have the roots of the extremism already in schools, because you have number of studies already done in educational system, how actually young children, like starting from the age of 8 or 9, are already embracing the extremist attitudes that they actually, you know, took from their parents. So, and they're not shown how actually to deal differently, because they're just multiplying or copy-paste the mechanism that they are available to them. And because they're immediately discriminated against, they're not able to come up with the new mechanisms for coping or problem solving. Then the second aspect is actually quite valuable, is the who is responsible for addressing the discrimination within the schools or educational systems, who has the responsibility. The primary responsibility, like, because of the Convention of the Rights of the Child, is quite like the convention, the Article 2 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child prohibits discrimination of children on any grounds. So the state has, especially like the states, but also the business, like private schools, have the obligation or duty to ensure that there is no discrimination within the schools, and then within the educational system, discrimination can be found in all actually aspects of educational system, starting from how we're treating children, actually in accessing the education. So for instance, if you have children who are invisible, like legally invisible, such as the Roma children who are not registered, they're immediately not able to access the education because they actually don't exist, because they're not registered. Then you have other issues, such as, for instance, with Roma children, because of their Roma, because they're usually living in poverty, because of the discrimination based on race. They're often those who drop out from the school and not able to complete the school, or actually education, elementary education, even though it's obligatory to have to go to elementary school. Then we have a lot of issues with the children with disabilities, who are also not able to access the to schools, and, you know, finish the schooling, etc., because of either the physical barriers or any other barriers that are imposed either on themselves personally or their parents. That also brings the issue of how you actually access the justice in matters of discrimination in education. First and foremost, you have developed a lot of protocols, especially building on the Convention of the Rights of the Child. So the first step is actually school being able to recognize the situations of discrimination and address it within its own institution. But often when you have those discriminatory practices that are based on underlying assumptions that are not so evident and that it's not easy to enforce, then you are faced with significant challenges, and that often comes to the structural discrimination in educational system. For instance, just to give an example of it, in US there was a study for provision of the health services, or actually underlying assumptions concerning women in health. So they found that the health providers had that underlying assumptions that women can sustain more pain than men. So when they came to actually complain about the pain that they're having, they were disregarded and they were not given the proper treatment. It's not, as from this example we can see the discrimination, it's not so always obvious, because sometimes those who are discriminating are not aware of those issues because it's deeply internalized. And then you have also what we learned from the gender equality initiatives and women's studies, is that you often also have the internalized oppression and internalized discrimination that is just enforced and not perceived as such. So one important aspect of working with discrimination or addressing the issues of, or solving the problems of discrimination is first focusing on how we perceive others and otherness. Is it like, do we build the narratives us against them always? And being in a constant tension. That brings us to the issue of the vulnerability, because heightened vulnerability or extreme is often used as a grounds for discrimination, because we are seeing ourselves as those who need to be protected, and then we use that protection or security as a ground for discriminating against others based on different grounds. If it's not race, then it's color, then it's gender or economic status, so it doesn't matter. The principle is always the same, it's us against them. And while law is like legal, especially judiciary is having an important role in addressing the discriminatory practices, the public administration, I think, has even more significant roles, because it's where actually the citizens interact with the state and where actually the most influence can be done. So, for instance, when you want to access the educational system, the national human rights institutions, if the inspectorate or those inspections are not providing the satisfactory protection, then you can go to the national human rights institution, who can make intervention and then support in children and their parents in accessing the justice. And the same goes for also civil servants working in the public school systems. Thank you.